it's a real pleasure for me today to introduce Chad Chadderton, who's basically, I was just trying to think when I first met you, probably that's my second day at the Chamber of Commerce. We had a meeting and Chad challenged, you won't remember this, but actually he challenged a few of us in the room as to say what we did. I'd literally been at the Chamber of Commerce for like 2 days, so I completely blagged it, made it all up, and then realised I actually knew nothing about the Chamber of Commerce and the job I'd just taken on. So that was slightly disconcerting. But the reason that Chad's here today is when we were talking about this, he's got some really strong and sometimes provocative ideas, but actually some really compelling ideas about how we need to start thinking about our cities and our communities. So I thought it was a really good opportunity, and yeah, really great that you can do this. So we'll probably have a bit more of a discussion, but I'll let Chad introduce himself properly. I've done it in a very rambly way, but try and engage as many of you as possible in the conversation, because I think that's what's most out there. Welcome, Chad.
Thank
and
you.
I'm Ali Boswijk, sorry, from the Chamber of Commerce, if you don't know who I am.
Hi, everyone. So the first thing I would say is that I'm not an expert on anything, okay, or one or two very, very niche things, but I like to think a lot, and I've been very lucky in that most of my career in the City of London, I've been paid to sit at my desk and think about things.
Sorry.
And heckling started already.
That got something weird.
And so I also travelled a lot around European cities, and I find it quite interesting that we get into these discourses in Nelson about how should our city look, how do we do this, when in fact there are thousands of cities around the world that have already predicted our future. And what we need to do is to learn from those cities, take what we like and leave what we don't like. But one of the things that I think that if we accept a vision for Nelson that might look something like a European city, then all of us have quite a significant mind shift to go through about how we live and how we interact with one another and what we think of as community. And one of the things that struck me when I was, in 2016, when an entrepreneurship program came to Nelson through Co-Starters, was the story of Chattanooga. And Chattanooga was an industrial city in Tennessee, and in the 70s it was one of the top cities in the US for manufacturing automobiles, and all of that ended and it became a rust bucket town. And then there was a Lyndhurst Foundation, which was started out by a very wealthy distributor of Coca-Cola. So he distributed around 15% of all Coca-Cola in the United States. He decided he was going to put his money into Chattanooga. So the first thing he did is start investing in the environment. So he pulled all the shopping trolleys out of the river and he put some nice walkways through and started to beautify it. Then interestingly, the second thing that the Lyndhurst Foundation did was really invest in arts and culture. Because what they recognized is that actually you don't have a community until you've fully invested and embraced the arts and culture that represents who we are and our stories. And that really caught me, and I really thought about that quite a lot. And then I started thinking, okay, so what have we got here in the centre of Nelson? Now, this is just opinion, right? And I'm going to sort of turn this on you guys pretty soon. And I would argue that if we think of community as an urban place or community of place, then I would argue that in the central city of Nelson we don't have a community at all, because there's not enough people living here. There's not enough people sharing their stories here. Because, and I think if you then think of community as sub-communities, we have neighbourhoods. We have lots of wonderful neighbourhoods in Nelson, and we have communities of interest. We have ethnic communities, religious communities, economic communities, and they all exist quite well. But in central Nelson, I would challenge we don't have a community. We have an economic zone that's well defined, but not a community. And one of the things I was pointing out to Ali is that this area here, from Nile Street east, so I run from coming from St. Vincent Street right across Nile Street east up to the river, across here and back down. That's roughly 840,000 square meters. We'll call it 1 square kilometer. Okay, that's all. How many people live in that area, do you think? Roughly, has anyone got a view?
I think I read about 70 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
About 1,000.
Maybe 1,000. So in West London, 20,000 people would live in that area. And in Barcelona, the most densely populated city that's really thought out, 44,000 people would live in that 1 square kilometre. So I think, what if we change the population dynamic of central Nelson? Supposing we had, in that 840,000 square kilometres, let's say, because I don't want to take away car parks, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek, just to keep those car park people happy, let's say 20% of that area is car park and roads, let's say 20% is open spaces, and let's say 20% is reserved for schools and education, where we want a proper indoor-outdoor interaction with children. That leaves about 40–50% of that space. We could sustain 4 or 5 different, or 6 or 7 different communities of 1,500 people, say around 10,000 people in that area, and still have half the population density of, say, Hammersmith in London. And we see how they live. So, and I'm talking here about, say, 4-story developments, no more. Paris is, I think, 4 or 5 stories. Vienna, London, the old parts of London. You know, we don't have to go to 6 stories, but if we think really cleverly, and we really focus building these communities on place, which means shelter and security, and then the next level, once we have that intensity, we provide those more emotional needs, such as a job, education and healthcare within that sector. And then the third level of this security, where we create a community of trust and communication and intimacy and love within that city centre, which is delivered through the arts, we can actually design and build over the next 50 to 100 years an intensified population of Nelson that is becoming self-sustaining economically and culturally. Then what I'd like to think, when I ponder on that, is to say, all right, Nelson, to my mind, has 2 issues, you know, at the very front of mind, I think. We're overly reliant on tourism, and it's looking pretty bleak out there now. You know, if we had a total self-sustaining economy within Nelson by creating population densities, tourists would be an adjunct to our economy, not the basis or a pillar of our economy. And the second things that strike me is that too many people leave Nelson when they're 18 or 19, and they don't come back. Because, and we don't offer those people that psychological security of a job, good social connection, intimacy, and that greater love and connection. So they leave, of course people leave to go and see bigger cities and travel around. But if we can create this density, and we really worked on investing in arts and community, maybe would attract more people here. Maybe we could have better jobs here. Then there's another idea that I have about this around, I've heard quite often here, you know, you're having a conversation with people who are in positions who really should know better. I'm talking councillors, I'm talking people who control significant parts of Nelson, way and things. Well, the problem with Nelson, we have an older population. How many times do we hear that? Why do we see this as a problem? Why don't we see older people as a phenomenal resource of knowledge, of wealth, and of cultural influence? If we had in this central Nelson community of, say, well, let's call it 6,000, supposing 2,000 of those people are retired and don't work, that's fantastic, because we don't have to provide a job, but those wealthy people are spending money in the clothing shops and the food shops and the art galleries and investing in the community. The next 1/3, or the next third, or the bottom third, are involved in education in some form. And the middle third, so approximately, you know, 3,000 people are looking to work. So some of those jobs could be sustained within this central city. And the way that you might envisage this, if you've been to Barcelona or you've been to Paris, you can imagine the density that we're talking about. And if that ground floor is retail commercial, the first floor is commercial office space, and then say the 3rd or 4th floors is a combination between the commercial or residential. That sort of vision. That's a lot of jobs. And then we flip this idea, is that you actually leave the city to go out to your place of work. Because it makes no sense to create this density between 9 till 5, and then we have this tumbleweed town from 6 o'clock through to 7 o'clock the next morning. What if we flip that around? And what if we said to businesses that are in the service industry, why are you opening at 10 o'clock and closing at 5? Isn't that ridiculous? You know, who can work like that? Well, supposing we flip that around and you open at 3 and close at 8. And so we start to create this more vibrant community that actually lives and breathes the way that we want to. All right, let's kick off a discussion. Who hates that idea? Who thinks that's a terrible idea? Let's have it.
I'm just going to pick up where you ended off saying open from 3 till 10.
Yes.
Try and get a cup of coffee after 3 o'clock in Nelson. But why do the retailers stop at 3? Because nobody's drinking coffee after 3.
Yes. This is one of my pet mysteries as well.
Chicken and egg sort of a thing.
Well, see, the thing is about Kiwis that I found is quite odd is that they all go to bed at 8 o'clock. And then the trouble is though, they get up at 6 o'clock and go out mountain biking and paddling. You know, Europe doesn't do that. You know, you're right, we finish dinner and we have a coffee and then that's it till 10 o'clock the next morning. We're not going anywhere. So it's quite a different shift. That idea, isn't it? You know, you can't get a coffee after 2 o'clock in Nelson. Pretty much. I think Yars is the only place that opens till 5 and that's because they do some evening entertainment.
Sweet Hares is open till 4.
Yeah.
Just my personal interest.
No, I'm with you.
Yeah, I'm curious when we look at I'm only just now curious, but when we're looking at cities that we love, we look at the end result and we go, that's great. But in Nelson, from the conversations I have, there's a real disconnect. It's almost like a Mexican standoff between commercial, property owner, retailer, council, resident. I had a chat today to a wonderful lady, great, but she resented looking after the plant pot in front of her shop because she thought it should be the council or Nelmac, although she'd done a lovely job of it. She was using it as a point to prove that the council is dysfunctional, which is interesting in itself. But I'm wondering when I'm rambling. When we look at these cities that are succeeding, who's done that? Have they come together as a community and taken on mixed responsibilities? Has the council just bulldozed through everything and done it? How does it get there? Because at the moment, it feels like we don't know how to get there. We know what success looks like, but we've no experience in a functioning community moving forward together.
Yep.
We've just got examples of it not moving forward.
Yep. Okay, so there's two questions there. The first part is to this disconnect between all the different elements, and I'll come on to that and address your second part first. One of the most significant downsides of the type sprawl development that we've got is the investment it takes in your local authority in terms of providing infrastructure. And you can map this out over the last few decades to say, you know, how many meters of utility cable or stormwater pipe and water delivery pipes do we have per person? And that's gone up something like tenfold over the last 100 years in Nelson. So if you increase the density, you actually then start to provide, so the work you're doing on Bridge Street, you know, if we start building that in terms of intensification and building infrastructure, we can substantially reduce the amount of, we can shorten that length of pipeline from something like maybe 30 or 40 meters per person to 2 meters per person. And that's a huge saving in costs. And then on top of that, if you had a population, if you were saying of those 1,500 communities, supposing, this is my maths on the fly here, supposing you had 4 community groups, like an arts and cultural community or centre of 1,500, and supposing 1/3 of those are paying rates of say 4,500 per year, so you've got 500 times 4,000, so that's 2 million, and you multiply that by 4, say that's 8 million just from residential rates. Then you've got commercial rates and retail rates, so you could actually take that rateable collection within that centre and take an order of magnitude greater return, which you then have got a multiple of saving on. So that's the first issue. The economics absolutely stack up for intensification of cities. In terms of who's responsible, I really like the point that you make there, because we've got ourselves into a funny mindset, haven't we, as a community, that the council or the government is somehow them and we are us. And we've forgotten that they represent us and they are us, and they're the stupidest people who've put their hand up to represent us when we then kick their ass for the next 3 or 4 years, isn't it? You know, we should be proud to take responsibility of our cities. You know, if I'm outside my house and I see rubbish on the verge, I pick it up and put it in my bin. you know, within reason. You know, if the branch has fallen off a tree, that might be beyond my capability. But I look that the council is very much there to help me live and have a more amenable city. And I think we need to change our attitudes to the property owners. So going back to your first point, one of my notes I put is, you know, who's responsible for changing all of this? I think if we beat the property owners up and we look at the economic pressures that they're under, we could have better conversations with those property owners. And I think this interacts with Plan Change 29, you know, in terms of intensification that seemed to be a plan without a strategy. You know, if we had a real vision for the design of our urban space and what it might look like and how we might fund it, and then we had groups of conversations where, and certainly I saw this in the UK, where a group of property owners would get together, you know, say 4 or 5 properties in a row, and they've all got to a certain age and they want to move on, so they unify the title on 4 or 5 properties, they have them developed into beautiful apartments and sell them, and maybe they keep an apartment. So if we had more respectful conversations, and I'm not saying they're not respectful at the moment, but you know, the key to success in any enterprise, you know, and I firmly believe this within companies and certainly with communities, is to have a respectful conversation with somebody you disagree with. You know, that's the secret. And if us as a community or group of people go to a property owner and say, look, we love this property, 6 of us here want to buy these apartments, there's 750,000 an apartment, so straight away you've got 4.2 million, let's get going. You know, let's go and build it. And we start, and we've got a design blueprint as to what these things look like. And what I'm talking about that is, you know, what does the veranda look like? What does the facing look like? What does the height look like? These are prescribed within a spatial plan. You know, because the building owner doesn't own the space. Nelson owns the space. They own the land, and they can own the building that's on it, but they don't. They need to be held accountable to Nelson for that visual spatial impact. So within that framework, they could, and that makes it easier for the builder. Most of the builders said there's one of these 20 designs you could have, and they talk to their best because they want the money. So you want this, this, this. Here it is. And this is why I'm saying it requires a different set of thinking. We can, all of the aspects of this design is about mitigating risk. It's all about eliminating risk. You were talking earlier about the risk from the business owners. You know, their primary concern about the development of Bridge Street is the risk that they can take. You know, how do we mitigate that risk? And remember, risk is never mitigated, it's never offset, it always just moves away, and the art is to figure out where it's gone. But to manage that risk the entire time is what we need to do here. So let's have better conversations between the people who want to live in Nelson, but let's take it upon ourselves to take that responsibility. And we do definitely need to beat the government up and the local authorities up around the Resource Act and how we want our spatial city to look and who's responsible for that infrastructure. Because putting that onto the developers is ridiculous too. You know, we need to have better conversations about who pays. Does that address you?
Yeah, it does in a way. I've not been in New Zealand long enough, but as Ali might know, has the responsibility of local government actually muddied the water in a way? Like if it was really narrow to infrastructure, we are literally responsible for the stuff. We're not responsible for how it's used or developed. But it feels like council's been broadened and broadened until suddenly everyone's going, well, who is responsible for?
And I think with the Local Government Act, when the 4 Wellbeings became part of the Local Government Act, that was a real confusion for people.
Yeah, okay.
In terms of how they then interacted with council, they saw that going way too far from where councils saw around the economic, environmental, social and cultural well-being.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, there was set a high expectation with the community that could never be delivered by a council.
Yeah.
So I think that, in my mind, and I've only lived here for 29 years, was probably the beginning of when council's role got slightly more confused for people, and the expectation was really high. And sorry to butt in on your conversation, but I think the other part for me is that we're really close to our rates bill. We know that $3,500 or that $4,000, we're really close to it. If you look at what most people pay in PAYE out of their wage, you don't even think about it.
Yeah.
It goes to a central pot. We vote, we may be disappointed with the government or not, but they spend the money on how they determine based on the policies they put in place. We are so disconnected from it, we don't even think about it. That $3,500 makes us feel we can say to councils, you're wrong, we pay your wages, we do all of these things, and actually gives us in this really combative place because we're so close to that bill. And I do think councils actually also need to think about how they articulate what that money is, because in actual fact, if you were to see that the average rates goes you get so much for that money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciating that $3,500 or whatever is there's a lot of cash out of some people's bank accounts, but the value for money is not understood. So I think we end up in the situation when you try and have conversations like this, which are actually very visionary in terms of where they may end up, people just haven't got the bandwidth because they just see, actually, I'm paying all this money and I've still got to do the plants in my pot outside it's like, surely you have to do that. That's just being a responsible citizen, but we've somehow disconnected from how we all support what's happening as well.
Yeah.
So I think we've just got to keep talking about it in a way that makes it positive, that we're spending this money and how we're spending it, as opposed to always just going into battle and going into our corners and lobbing things at each other. Because that's why we end up with nothing happening, and why we're all here and frustrated.
I think there's an element of NIMBYism, because Plan 29 can't have lots of tall buildings. There's Kaingaora development. People can't have state housing in the middle of town. Whereas along Hardy Street, there's 2 or 3 businesses have just gone quietly up and put apartments on top of them. Do we need to do this by stealth or in small groups rather than trying to
I think
involve everyone?
We're not everyone's going to be happy by this. So the reason why I define that central city for your high intensity development, because nobody really lives there anyway. So a few people do, and the buildings are already close together. So there's Plan Change 29 was very provocative in the idea that your neighbour was tomorrow going to build a 19.5 metre apartment block within 1 metre of your boundary, and it was a wonderful piece of theatre in terms of creating that images to overcome it, to battle Plan Change 29. Those of us who are very good, not me over there, who is very good at creating those visual images and those very stories are very powerful people in our community, very powerful people. So I think, as Ali says, we need to, I always used to say, this is really controversial, I used to say, to make your point, okay, first day of school, beat up the fat kid, all right? And then you get your way for the rest of the time. That's what we need to do in Nelson. You're looking horrified. I don't mean that deliberately. Please don't do that. I feel terrible now. But that's what we need to do. We need to pick on one street and we say, right, let's do it here. And we need to do it in that guerrilla warfare. We need to do it street by street. We need to create these, like Bet's car park. Man, the torch and pitchfork brigade were out on there, weren't they, to not do it. Now we look at Bet's car park as an example of how we could be living in our the beautiful courtyards. That it's not that objectionable, is it? Personally, I wouldn't want to live there and have my bedroom window straight out on the cathedral, but it gives you an example. And once we've got that example, it's easy to say, what if we built that here? The Noodle Canteen place, that lucky bastard who got his building burnt down, and the insurance built him a beautiful new building. He's got some
I've
nice
been in
apartments.
it.
Is it
amazing.
nice?
Yeah, they're really good. Ruth had a question as well.
Yeah, I think I agree all the conversations need to take place, but I would consider part of the early, some of the early sentences you used are quite critical in this, in that if you, a bit like Alec, having lived all over the world, if you look at the cities that you've talked about, there's a want and a desire to live in a certain way, and as you highlighted here, everybody lives very differently. So I guess it's what comes first, and in all the forecasting around how it might take place within this environment, how do we change? Are we building first and they'll come? Is that what happened? Or are we looking at how the lifestyle may or may not change to support what you're talking about? Because I agree entirely in terms of all the cities you mentioned, and having lived in them all, more or less, I see how that works, but there's a desire for it to work in the first place.
Who here would be okay living in an apartment like Bet's car park if it was more affordable in central Nelson? Who would be okay with that? Who would really? The one opposite the cathedral. So I think who would not like that? Who would? See, I probably wouldn't like that so much.
Not as it is now.
Yeah, no, not as it is now.
It has to do with families and the whole culture, and ring a bell. In fact, there's an interesting contradiction of yours. The first opening sentences were how about creating an inner city that reflects our culture? But our culture is, well, all the Kiwis, like you can hear, I'm born here. Their culture is really the paradise in your family home with the garden and the dog and a motor car for every adult in it. And in Europe, it's sort of where I come from. Whole families lived several generations in an apartment, and they don't even own it.
Yes.
They rent it for 50 years or 100 years, you know, sort of. So that's a different culture. So the contradiction for me is we are not wanting to represent our current culture, maybe about arts and pottery and dining, but the living space is change of culture, and it'll be quite hard. But it interests me, and it puts Chris probably on your mills when they now tell us, oh, there's all these old people in that, so we can't probably do this. If you look at a person's life, there's only a period probably of 30, 40 years where they need a home with the garden and the fence and the dog. Like up to the age of 25, well, let's say young adults, and where they're educated, they probably don't want all that. And then there's family time. And then most parents, and like when I left home, my dad and my family moved out from an owned house and with a garden into rented properties. So all these so-called old people, if you really look at their needs, they may actually enjoy that. In fact, if you look at these retirement villages, they are like just the living spaces, and the grounds are sort of looked after by somebody else. So that's a cultural shift. But you know, whoever tells you nowadays these old people we can't do it is just the opposite. In fact, I mean, they could occupy, or a lot of them, me included, and I raise my hand for the Betts car parks thing, would probably enjoy that, or it could be more. They are more likely than the ones in their 30s and 40s who really have families, and you know, the apartment is a bit of a stretch for them.
I think as well, though, it's how you, and I think you might have said not how it is now, in terms of living in the city. So it's, and I don't know exactly what you meant, but I interpreted what you meant as being, it's not an environment you would want to live in the city at the moment, even at which I think is the whole thing. You need to make the backyard work for everybody, don't you? So which is where you need to invest in the arts and cultural infrastructure.
Absolutely right.
So that actually you've got a place where you would love to live there because it's got all of the amenity that you need really close to home. And you,
you can walk. That's the definition. That's the definition of a community, because I take your point. You're absolutely right. So one of the things I'd say about that, when I was I was up in Auckland, I can't remember why, and I was staying in this. I was doing a Coast Artist thing. I was up in Auckland, and I'd been put up in this apartment, and I didn't know what it was, and I hadn't realised that it was a 30-storey building which was all apartments. So I think Kiwis could make that transition. You know, I don't really want to live in an earthquake zone in a 30th floor of an apartment, but you know, others might. But we could make that transition. But I think just having that option, but it's not right for everybody. A whole lot of people want a small garden, you know, but you know, I take your point of view entirely, but I think when I look at every city in the world, this intensification looks like every major city in the world, and not like what we were envisaging with our plan changes, just about more. So we put more onto a quarter-acre plot, and it still looks exactly kind of like the house that our parents had, and that's how we intensify. I don't think that's the right way. I mean, it might be a way. We might be unique in making that successful, but I'm not sure that's the way forward.
Can I say something? It's sort of spurious, but I grew up in Dunedin and it was cold, and Wellington's sort of like that too. And so when you've got that hideous weather, you know, you want to be. It's easier to become central. You don't have the garden. You don't do things in your garden. Even though I grew up in a place that did have a garden, but in a way, a climate like this, I remember when I came up here finally to live, and it was parallel play. We didn't grow up necessarily doing sporty things. It was more art and books and things like that. But everybody here it was the hardest place I found to make friends, because everybody was on their bike and exercising and sporting, which you alluded to. And so it was much harder to really make friends, because everybody was out doing things. So it's spurious, but I'm just saying the climate here, in a way, sends you off to the beach, and it's easier to do that.
So I think that a local community is somewhere where you walk, somewhere where you live. And what I think we're missing by proposition is that we don't actually have a community in Central Nelson. This is my challenge. is because we don't live here, work here, eat here, shop here, and the number of cars, because car parks are such an issue because we commute into this place. You know, if you have to travel to somewhere, that place you're going to, by definition, isn't your community. And if we built this central city concept of a community off the models that already exist and create that density, we would get those little sub-communities of 150 people who would be your acquaintances, and those 50, or those people you know, those 50 people are your acquaintances, and those 15 people are your friends, and we would start to build those communities within the centre. That intensification would build those connections which all of us need for our health and well-being, and that's what's missing. And it's missing in London as well. You know, it is so perverse. You know, what we'd all do, I'd get on, when I eventually moved out, I lived in Islington most of my life, which is fantastic, you know, but when I had children, we moved out, so I'd get on the train. You don't talk to anybody on the train, okay, you don't do that. And you go and you sit in the office, okay, and you don't talk to your work colleagues, okay, because they're all idiots, and you sit there and you type away, and then at 7 o'clock in the evening, you do the whole thing in reverse. So all of these satellite towns around London emptied, and everyone went into the city where we grumbled and bitched about, you know, that's the only time you talk to your work colleagues, when you can grumble and complain about the weather and your commute into town. You're working all day and then you go home again. I mean, this is crazy, it's ridiculous, isn't it? We just need to stop thinking about how we live that way because we've always done it. Because it's no longer possible. We've got 8.5 billion people on the planet, and unless we make substantial changes, we're going to peak at 11. We've got to think about the climate and how we're utilising the resources that we've got. So that means intensification.
And we've got increasing health and well-being issues around anxiety and loneliness and all of the things that we've got, where actually we know that by being in communities that support you also support that.
That's right.
Yeah. We're going to have to stop actually because we've come to time now, but that's been really interesting. So
thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you for your input.
Yeah, no,
Thanks.
that's been really, really good.
We're all
Yeah, we do. Fantastic. I think we're going to have to keep talking about